Hi, this is Chiezan, the prior at SokukoJi Buddhist Monastery. If you value these talks and would like them to continue, please visit our donate page at www.sokukoji.org. Thank you.
Thank you for being here for Basic Buddhist Teachings. This evening, I'm going to talk about something that I was recalling. I did talk about this once, but it was long ago when I was doing monk training talks on Saturdays. And this topic is called the Four Afflictions. And there needs to be, I think, a little bit of background information on what the four afflictions are and where that comes from. And it's a traditional teaching that comes out of this structure that we call the eight consciousnesses. The eight consciousnesses, similar to the five skandhas, are another conceptual way to break down how we create identity, or how identity or the sense of a being comes together. So with these eight consciousnesses, the first six are pretty straightforward. That would be the sense consciousness of sight, smell, taste, sound, and the most rudimentary form of thinking, just the pure, simple, mechanical thought consciousness. I'm going to skip to the eighth consciousness because to me, the seventh consciousness is kind of the focal point. So you have the first six consciousnesses. You have the eighth consciousness that's called the Alaya Vijnana, or the storehouse consciousness. It's also sometimes called the repository consciousness. And what I think of it as is it's a storehouse for karmic tendencies. If there is such thing as past lives, this is probably where those tendencies are stored. A more direct, tangible experience of the eighth consciousness is when we all share a similar physical environment and experience, and yet we all have tremendously different responses. Someone has a very positive experience, someone has a very neutral experience, someone has a very negative experience. You could say that this charge is coming from the eighth consciousness. The reaction, the projection is coming from the eighth consciousness. The seventh consciousness, that's called manas vijnana, is sometimes called the appropriating consciousness because it takes these first six experiences, sight, smell, taste, sound, touch, and mind. And then when those six sense fields become charged with our habit energy, our dispositions, our tendencies, the seventh consciousness takes those and says, this is my experience. It's my sight. It's my anger. It's my happiness. And so this seventh consciousness also could be called the ego. And the four afflictions can be talked about as occurring in the seventh consciousness. And I'm not planning to talk about Vasubandhu tonight. I don't want to. I probably couldn't. But I did want to read the one verse from the 30 verses that directly addresses manas vijnana. It's actually several, but in verse 6, it specifically talks about these four afflictions. And this is Stefan Anaker's translation, which has been studied a great deal. I would imagine perhaps hundreds of times we've been through these 30 verses, going way back. So the sixth verse goes like this, and this is in reference to manas vijnana. It is always conjoined with four afflictions: obstructed but indeterminate, known as view of self, confusion of self, pride of self, and love of self. And so just the one comment about that, when it says obstructed but indeterminate, my understanding of that, which is pretty limited, is that these four afflictions really seem to get their hooks in us. Love of self, pride of self, self-delusion, self-reference, but fundamentally indeterminate, meaning they have no karmic disposition. They're not actually charged towards something. It's through the appropriation of these consciousnesses, through the appropriation of our positive, negative, and neutral experiences, they become karmically charged. So what I really wanted to talk about were these 4 afflictions, and I thought I would give you the Sanskrit too, just maybe it's interesting or helpful, but the view of self is called Atma Drishti, Atma meaning self. Self-delusion is Atma Moha. The pride of self is Atma Mana, and the love of self is Atma Sneha. And if we were to look at these 4 afflictions, to me, the differentiation is relatively small. They all root out of the misunderstanding of self and other, and it may be more just the way in which we tend towards one or a couple, or the way in which we tend towards all 4. But you could start out with the view of self. Very simple. It could almost be relatively objective. Just, I am here. I am functioning. I am existing. I am feeling, seeing, smelling, tasting, touching. Delusion, self-delusion, to me, has a layering on quality. It has just the relative logic and the objectivity that can function because we believe we're here and something's there, and so we interact with it. But the delusion seems to be a further layering on. In the traditional teachings, this would be called the imagined nature. Pride of self has a certain edge to it. It's when we start to take a view of self, the delusions, the laminations onto them, and then we start to feel possessive of those delusions. We actually start to take credit. We start to hold territory in such a way that we feel entitled to our very logical possessiveness. So there can be quite a bit of defensiveness with the pride of self. And the love of self can just be a sort of self-adoration. To me, it's kind of an extension of pride. It may not have the same sort of paranoia around it, but just how wonderful that I've figured this out. I've been able to accomplish so much. When we look at the structure of the 8 consciousnesses, if we talk about this in the way that Sokuzan's teaching, it's not a matter of these 4 afflictions ceasing, because in essence, all of the 8 consciousnesses are delusions. As long as they're solidified, as long as they're differentiated in such a way that we feel that we can possess or deal in them. But it does seem important to look at how we use these 4 afflictions as protectors, how we use them to create a narrative that allows us to hold the territory of identity. If it were just the first 6 consciousnesses, I think it would be much simpler, because again, those first 6 have a relative objectivity. They have a relative functional quality to them. But at the level of the 8th consciousness, where these habit energies, these dispositions, these tendencies start to latch on, it becomes inflamed, it becomes illogical, you could say, through a sense of emotionality. There's no disbanding in a sense of getting rid of the 8 consciousnesses. And perhaps in part because, as Sokuzan would say, they're not real, they're not something to be gotten rid of, but there's something to be seen clearly. And so if the 7th consciousness is no longer appropriating through self-love, through self-pride, through self-delusion, through self-reference, the habit energy, the tendencies, the dispositions may continue to function. But if they're not grasped, it's almost like an image of a weapon. Like if you grasp the habit energy, then you wield it for and against things. Whereas if it's not grasped, it's able to just function. And this is just a way of talking about it. But when we look at it in a structure like this, the 8 consciousnesses, the other part that is a little bit seductive is to think that this is can be worked with objectively. But when we get into the actual practice of looking directly at these 4 afflictions, love of self, pride of self, self-delusion, self-reference, it's exceptionally painful. Because we're not just maintaining self through logic. It's not just we're telling ourselves a reasonable story. There is an irrationality to it because of the rawness that we see or perceive our world without those 4 afflictions. So we're actually able to mitigate suffering. We're actually able to soften suffering through possessing these 4 afflictions. And when I say mitigate suffering, I'm not even saying that you're turning down the heat on it. These 4 afflictions may actually inflame the negativity, but what it does to a lot of us within our mind, it at least justifies, it validates negativity, it validates right and wrong. And so we would actually we'd rather maintain the illusion of self and other, even if it means experiencing tremendous negativity, as opposed to begin to see through the territoriality. And I think that's a difficult aspect of the path to confront, because most of us come onto the path and there is a logical progression of the teachings and they resonate. They actually can be very seductive to that identity because they do make sense. And idealized, we would love to live a selfless life. But again, it's at that level of appropriation where we don't fundamentally want to lose the territory. So we continue to reify what this is through believing in the self, defending territory. I think self-reference is a really interesting one to look at because it's like putting everything in the context of you. And I don't know, I can share this, and I don't know if I'm unique in this, but if you've ever had a loved one, like someone close to you, die, and you think about how people will treat you, it's like it's all about you and how the sympathy you might receive, or those kind of things, or maybe the lack of attention you want. So it's always about, for me, it's always about me. There was a situation here years ago with a resident who's long gone, and there was some addiction occurring, there was a medical emergency, and the only person I could think about was myself. It's terribly humiliating. It's like really all I could think about was myself. It wasn't the other people in the building who had just been through the same thing. It wasn't about this person being taken to the hospital in an ambulance. That self-reference, we take everything we experience and we put it in the context of how we feel about it, how we will look, how we will be perceived. So just one more time, I thought I'd read the 6th verse and see if there are any questions. It is always conjoined with 4 afflictions, obstructed but indeterminate, or without karmic directionality, I guess you could say, or without, it's not positive, negative, or neutral. Known as view of self, confusion of self, pride of self, and love of self, or Atma Drishti, Atma Moha, Atma Mana, and Atma Sneha. So are there questions about these afflictions or these aspects of consciousness? Unyo.
So with the storehouse, the 8th consciousness, you call it karmic tendencies. So are you saying that if there isn't anything acted on, that those karmic tendencies don't arise? Bowing?
I don't think that it's even that nothing is acted on. An image that's been used, it's like if the fire is completely burned out, there's no aspect of passion, aggression, or ignorance to leave a further karmic imprint. So you're not functioning out of identity, you're not functioning out of a self, so therefore there's nothing to further imprint. but it does not mean that those tendencies don't continue to manifest as aspects of dependent origination. So I don't understand from what I've studied with Sokuzan and having studied this a little bit, that a realized being, there's absolutely the eighth consciousness just ceases to function. It just seems that it's no longer recognized as personal. I think that's very disappointing, and I think some of us have that realization early on, is that it shows up like, why me? Why do I have to be this way? I didn't choose this. So this is us battling the eighth consciousness, these things that are just coming down, they're functioning, and we never had a say-so in any of that. Sokuzan will say, you didn't choose, the color of your hair, how tall you are, the shape of your ears. And there was somebody years ago that Sokuzan was relating to who was just furious at his mom and dad for having him because he didn't get a choice. And so to me, that very much resonates of the eighth consciousness.
When you're bowing, and maybe you answered this and I didn't understand, but do we still have karma to fulfill then? Bowing?
If what?
If the eighth, if nothing happens in the eighth with those tendencies.
I don't know. I think one way you could say it is, if karma needs to be fulfilled, it fulfills itself. It's not, again, it's not personalized, although it may be happening in a localized sense because we're embodied. So what's interesting to me is when you listen to Sokuzan teach, there's no need to end dependent origination or to interrupt dependent origination. Dependent origination is not the problem. It's not real. It's the sense of ownership or the feeling that dependent origination is very personal that needs to be investigated. So I don't think, again, that anything in the eighth consciousness needs to cease so much as the aspect that is continuously grasping at those illusions, which we call dependent origination.
Mr. Bowing, is there anything in the seventh consciousness besides these four afflictions? It sounds like they just are the seventh consciousness.
Well, I don't know that any of this actually exists in a physical or temporal sense. It's a way of conceptualizing, it's a way of creating concepts to investigate consciousness. So if you wanted to, I'm sure you could create 8 afflictions, or I'm sure you could reduce those down to 2 afflictions, just like the poisons. So we're most familiar with the 3 poisons of passion, aggression, and ignorance, but there's also the 5 poisons of passion, aggression, ignorance, pride, and jealousy. So it's not so literal that we need to hyper-analyze it, but we could use it, or you might hyper-analyze it. You use it to investigate or look. And if you do want to go very, very deep scholastically, as you know, Bill Waldron wrote that book, Making Sense of Mind Only, which I think he did a really nice job based on our feedback to him of making it a little more accessible, but it's still pretty dense material looking at the history. It's very historical, I would say. I think he does a nice job historically looking at the Pali Canon and the evolution of the different schools of thought with Madhyamaka and Yogacara to say this is how these 8 consciousness came to be in a conceptual sense.
Mr. Bowing, I think my question is partly trying to understand better the indeterminate part, or I think you said it was not karmically directional, the 4 afflictions. And so I'm just, yeah, it seems like they are the structure of ego. So it seems like that would be karmically really charged. I'm confused about that part.
It comes to me, if it would be at the appropriating level. The causes and condition for anger have nothing to do really with this locality. But when those causes and conditions come together and that anger arises, we do something with it, which is either try to get rid of it or find a source that we can blame. And so the energy in and of itself has no personal quality, nor does it have any predetermined karmic disposition. It's really at the level of us solidifying it or appropriating it to say, this is my anger, this is my jealousy, this is my pride, and I have a right to feel this way, or even saying it's unreal. That story spins the same, it seems like it spins the same cycle because it's still an identity trying to make it about me. It's not mine, it is mine.
Sokuko bowing. So I guess, I don't know, could you maybe just say again how the 4 afflictions aren't karmically charged? Or what that means?
So I will give an example in that the causes and conditions, meaning that the infinite variables, both that we can recognize and variables we cannot recognize, come together so that the energy of aggression arises. That aggression isn't positive, negative, and neutral in its most raw sense. It's Trungpa Rinpoche would talk about it as just simply energy. And to me, that's why it can be there and present and functional on the Bodhisattva path. But what tends to happen, those causes and conditions for anger come together, the energy arises, and we find it distasteful, so we do something with it. We actually further that cycle. We express it internally or externally. We take it personal. We blame others for it. And to me, it's at that level that it takes on that karmic direction or that karmic quality. So with the way Sokuzan talks about it, and this is something he asked me to talk about initially, and I think it's the first time I asked him if I could not talk about something. He asked me to talk about the 12 links on the chain of dependent origination, which I still have a hard time understanding. It's not something I can even intellectually go through quite yet. But the one part that does stand out is when he talks about desire and grasping, that the desire, you could say, is like the causes and conditions come together where something is pleasant. You want something, but it really doesn't have much power until it gets to that next link of grasping, where you actually solidify something that's just, it's an energy that's so intense, you're not okay with it just being there. So we have to take it personally and we create a container around it and we function out of it. And so it's in that sense that I'm just going based on as best I can understand this, where the lack of karmic direction or karmic charge is, it's just dependent origination. It's like saying that the wind has no karmic qualities, but then you start getting mad because it's windy, or you're happy because you can fly a kite, but just the basic energy of air moving really doesn't even have a neutrality to it. It's not positive, negative, or neutral.
Sokuko bowing, thank you, that's helpful. Is pride of self, for instance, pride of self and self-delusion, are those built on grasping?
Are pride of self and self-delusion built on grasping? I would say that there's a pretty intimate relationship there. That again, it's not that you might not have that energy of pride or that energy of what was the other one you said? Pride and delusion. But it really seems that it doesn't take form until we identify with it, or we say it's mine. We think that it's very personal, and it's hard not to when it arises in the discrete situation that we call our bodies. Thank you. Neil?
And so in that situation, if and you said Rinpoche refers to it as energy. So is there any quality to that energy? We name is it when we name it aggression or anger that it then begins to take on a like or a dislike or a neutral?
What's difficult for me to understand or to consider is that even the naming doesn't have to be personal, because that could just be the causes and conditions of naming coming together. It's very much about the belief in the name that you ascribe to it. If we hear a train horn, it may just be very natural to have a sense that that's a train horn. I don't think that that kind of conditioning that arises immediately indicates a sort of grasping. So it becomes sticky because as SokukoJi says, we don't have to get rid of anything. So there's nothing you can point to that says, well, this is the absolute indicator of self-delusion, because anything could continue to rise. Because if self-delusion is ultimately defined by one thing, then it's saying, well, clarity is defined by its absence. If this is confusion, then clarity has to be the absence of it, and you're right back into that dualistic mindset. So oftentimes it's talked about you can't think your way into this. And again, when that begins to arise, it's much more threatening than we projected the teachings would be, because we felt very confident, or become more confident with the teachings or aspects of the teachings because they almost soothe the identity. But when it starts to show up, I think it can be very threatening.
Yvonne, I'm still looking at that at the karma. When we're born, we have evidently some karma that we have to live out. And I think SokukoJi was talked about with Rinpoche, that he still had karma to live. Is there, I don't know, is there any escape from karma?
The way it shows up to me is the idea of being ensnared by karma, or being able to escape from karma, still has the mentality of accomplishing the path. And so we're still looking at defining progress on the path as the presence or the absence of something. And that's where it's so it's like a migraine. It's so disorienting, because we can't really get a foothold on this. So when you say, is there an escape from karma, it shows up to me as I still want there to be some sort of relief that is the absence of what is coming down, coming down the hill, coming down the slide.
But if you don't do anything with what's arising, where's karma in that? Bowing.
Well, again, it's what's curious is you can't actually not do anything with what is arising. There's still some sort of positionality that requires an absence of functioning, an absence of doing something with the karma. It still has to do with a narrative that makes sense conceptually. I don't know how to, I think that's where a lot of us are in our practice. It's like, I don't know what's happening. And at that point, there's no justification. You can't really find any backup for anything. So this is where that teaching of returning becomes even more important. Returning's not, to me, an elementary teaching. It's what helps us continue to function when we lose the reference points of logic and reasoning. So I don't know that I can answer your question other than to say anything that you say, if it makes you feel better about it, that good feeling can only last so long, and it won't actually carry you into anything. This is some of the teaching I was getting from SokukoJi today in my Dokusan. Essentially just reminding me that whatever experience I'm having won't last, doesn't really define anything. And what it does define is doesn't need to be focused on because it's not substantial. It's not an indicator. It's just, this is the way the moon is waxing and waning. This is the way the breeze is going today. To me, it's very disappointing. Thank you. So Corinne.
So Corinne Bowing, what are you focusing on?
Having a hard time focusing, as you know. I don't know. I am trying to give my attention to my practice. I'm trying to give my attention to Sokuzan, but I can't say I'm feeling more. Is that the term, moored? Like you moor a boat? I'm not feeling particularly moored right now, and so again, this is why that idea of returning, it's almost it's a type of conditioning. It doesn't have to be reasonable. It's not necessarily returning to a concept. It's just the very gesture of returning. So I don't know if I were to say anything, just trying to continue to return to my practice.
So Corinne Bowing, what does it mean to return or focus on your practice when that is arising in your practice?
I think in a very literal sense, this doesn't have to be abstract at all. I mean, trying to find time to sit in meditation.
So Corinne Bowing, if in your meditation there is phenomena arising and you don't know what's happening, where do you focus?
Well, to me, the nice thing is once you get to the cushion, that there's no need to navigate from there. So I don't understand my practice to be needing any focus once I sit down. So there's no real agenda or roadmap. And so the focus is, I don't know that I would use that word so much, but the returning to sitting down, if we want to call that focus or intention, but yeah, is there more?
So Corinne Bowing, the distastefulness, I think, I can't remember the word you used. When the discomfort arises and the seventh consciousness arises alongside of it. Okay, let me ask it differently. Does suffering have an identity?
I really appreciate that question, and the best I can say is that what I've been told, and that's that the suffering itself is unreal. It does not mean it doesn't have incredibly sharp edges, but it lacks substance. It lacks a type of substantiality that we impute onto it. So the suffering, as far as the texture, probably is always going to be very distasteful. But again, it comes down to not what the apparent suffering is, but how it provides a sort of contrast to see the positionality that is offended by the suffering, that tries to accept the suffering, that tries to reject the suffering, that tries to ignore the suffering. And to me, that's something that, again, it won't last, but everything is indicating that positionality. So instead of, there was I don't know, an old Tibetan story about covering the entire world with like deer skin or like yak skin. Have you heard this? And the monk said, just cover the bottom of your feet. All you need to do is cover the bottom of your feet. And to me, the idea there is that you will find infinite expressions of suffering, and you will never be able to resolve all the infinite expressions of suffering. But all those infinite expressions of suffering are pointing to one thing, which is that which resists the suffering. So instead of resolving the myriad aspects of suffering or concerning ourselves too much with the suffering itself, to me, it's how do we use that suffering to look at what appears very solid as an identity. Thank you. Go ahead, Navid.
Maybe is consciousness only outside these 8 consciousnesses? Bowing.
I don't know from a technical standpoint. I think the Yogacara school is sometimes called mind only. And again, I know there's a few people here that might be able to speak to this better. So like Yogacara, or is it Vijñāti Matrata? Is that consciousness only as well? And I think they're talking about 2 different things conceptually. But I also know that Sokuzan, I think even tonight in As It Is, said something along the lines that there's only consciousness. So I don't know that I'm too qualified to parse that out. I apologize.
Maybe bowing. I have another question about consciousness only. I was wondering if consciousness only, does that still feel like a self? Bowing.
I don't know. I think that particularly on the Bodhisattva path, whatever material arises can be used for the benefit of others if we're not filtering it through the belief in an identity. So again, I don't know, but it seems that the sense of self could show up, and Sokuzan's even said it could show up even stronger. So it's perhaps something for all of us to consider what that is pointing at.
Thank you.
I'd like to close for the night. Thank you very much.
Hi, this is Chiezan, the prior at SokukoJi Buddhist Monastery. If you value these talks and would like them to continue, please visit our donate page at www.sokukoji.org. Thank you.